Hello, historians, and welcome to On This Day in History, your daily insight into what has happened in the past, how it's influenced the events of the present on this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So let's take a short look at what's happened on this day. So, on this day in history, the 15th of June, in the year 1215, King John of England signs the Magna Carta at Runnymede, just outside of Windsor in England. This would go on to become the foundation of many modern laws, and in fact is referenced in various legal codes around the world, and is quite a significant moment. Ironically, in 1626, on this very day, where the Magna Carta was designed to show that the king was not above the law, on this very day in 1626, King Charles I disbands English Parliament, gets rid of the Parliament because he believed he was above the law. In 1878, and we can see this on the right-ish, the world's first moving pictures are caught on camera. So 12 cameras each took one picture, and this was the first attempt at essentially a movie, if you will, capturing something on film. And the purpose of it was to see if all four of a horse's hooves leave the ground when it runs. And as you can see from our images, that does indeed happen as a horse goes into a gallop at one stage of its rapid movement. It actually has no contact with the ground whatsoever. So that was in 1878. They proved that once and for all, changing the world. Not because they found out about the horses, but because of the invention of film, obviously. In 1888, uh, Wilhelm II becomes Emperor of Germany, or in German, Kaiser. He becomes the Kaiser of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. If you are not familiar with the name, all you need do is look into World War One, and you will see that he plays quite the prominent role in the outbreak, the escalation, and if nothing else, especially in English propaganda. On this day in 1940, France officially surrenders to Nazi Germany and Nazi troops occupy Paris. You can see in this image on the right the famous picture of Hitler having his picture taken in front of the Eiffel Tower. This became a very powerful tool for German propaganda and was actually used to try and convince Britain to surrender, lest you face the indignity of Hitler standing triumphantly in front of the Houses of Parliament or Big Ben. So this picture was indeed quite famous. Now, France had not necessarily already lost by this point, but their formal surrender uh, was accepted, obviously, on this particular day, but the Nazis or the Germans at that stage had already uh, conquered France, had already defeated the French military by that stage. And on this day in 1983, Black Adder, the famous comedy show starring Rowan Atkinson and Tony Robinson, written by Richard Curtis and Rowan Atkinson, premieres on BBC One. Now, there were only 4 seasons of this particular show and a couple of Christmas specials or one-off uh, re reunions of the cast for various charity purposes. But in those 4 seasons, we saw Blackadder go from medieval times all the way up to World War One. They were with stopovers, of course, in revolutionary France, revolutionary and contemporary Victorian London. Absolutely one of the huge influences on comedy as a whole, but especially on uh, impressionable young viewers such as myself that thought history was fascinating because of programs such as this. As a matter of fact, I think if there was only one thing I could teach students about World War One, I would have them watch Blackadder Goes Forth, the 4th season, where they are in the trenches of World War One. I think you learn absolutely everything there is to know about the Western Front from that program. And my goodness, is it funny. Uh, so please, if you have not already, go back and watch some episodes of this particular show. Keeping in mind that you most likely know Rowan Atkinson as Mr. Bean. This was before Mr. Bean. He was already a famous comedian by that stage, and his performance is spot on, as is the performance of almost every single person. And the irony, of course, being that Tony Robinson plays something of a dim-witted fool throughout most of the series, and he would go on to spend the rest of his life as an intellectual, hosting various BBC history documentaries where most students come across him most often, and it can be quite humorous to see him play that role of the dim-witted fool, and he does it very well. Now then, for the deep dive of the day, we're going to actually look at the Magna Carta, of course. It is such a phenomenal document. Now, some people say the Magna Carta saw the end of the feudal system. That's not necessarily entirely true, but it is important to know how the feudal system works for why the Magna Carta was important. So the feudal system places the king at the top, and the king gives land to those below him. So this is what we have as a hierarchy. He gives land to the barons, and in response, the barons pay money and provide military soldiers, knights in this case, to the king for his various wars abroad. So it's supposed to be a cooperation, if you will. The barons support the king, and the king helps out the barons. Now, that obviously goes down the line as well, where the barons help out their knights, and the knights help out their peasants, etc., etc., with the idea being that going all the way up and all the way down this particular system, everyone owes tribute to the person above, and they have a responsibility to care for, if you will, those below. Didn't exactly work like that in reality. But on this day, the Magna Carta, or also known as the Great Charter, the Charter of English Liberties, was granted by King John on June 15th, 1215. Well, that sounds amazing. He's granting all these liberties, giving all these freedoms on this day. Well, there we go. Deep dive done, right? Not exactly. I'm sure you're aware, it's always more complicated than that. So this particular document with King John granting all of these so-called liberties was actually signed under duress. The king did not want to give any liberties. He did not want to grant any freedom, but the barons were forcing his hand. They were threatening a civil war. They were threatening to go to war with their own king. So he thought he would sign this document in order to avoid a war. So this is important when we remember this document, or when you take the statements made about the Magna Carta. You must understand that this was not the king or the barons trying to expand freedom and create this ideal society. This was to settle a dispute between the king and his barons. It was reissued with many alterations, in fact, in 1216, 1217, and 1225, and in fact, many years after that as well, with its most final outcome being in 1297. More on that in a moment. So why then is there so much focus put on this one in 1215 if it was reissued just a year later, and then the next year, and again and again and again? Well, this was the big deal about it. This declared the sovereign, the king, to be subject to the rule of law, and documenting the liberties held by, quote, free men. So the Magna Carta provided the foundation for individual rights. Now, this is important to know. It seemed obvious today, but the king was essentially above the law. The king could do whatever he wanted. It was impossible for the king to break a law. No one holds the king accountable ever. That's not a thing until the Magna Carta put that idea forward. And this idea that there are certain liberties owed to free men, that's going to become quite important, because free men were actually uh, pretty rare to find in the feudal system in England at the time, because free men refers to people who are able to do whatever they wish. Peasants are not in that group. Knights are not in that group. They have to follow the orders of those above them. By the term free men, this was referring to sort of the upper echelon, the upper class, the lords, the aristocracy, the barons, if you will. But because of the particular phrasing, this document becomes quite important. So the idea was, and this cartoon I think explains it quite well, that the Magna Carta would restrain the king and limit the king's powers. Why were the barons upset with him in the first place? Well, King John had fell out with the Pope. He was not on the best of terms. The Pope banned John from the church, excommunicated him from church. English churches were all closed down. Now keep in mind, at this time in the year 1215, there is only one church in Western Europe, the Catholic Church. Catholic itself means universal, the one church. So the Pope is at the head of all of those churches, and he can decide what happens. Now, the church, as important as it is to many people around the world today, it was 20, 50, 1,000 times more important to the people in those times. So the Pope saying, no more church because I don't like your king, that turns a lot of people against the English king. It makes the king look very, very bad. Now, why is that important? Because if you've got peasants that are upset with their king and you're a baron, you've got angry peasants in your land. You're worried what they might do. Not only that, but King John had also lost French lands, in particular Normandy. And as a result of this defeat in war, he had to up the taxes owed by his local barons to him in order to pay to make up the shortfall for the money he wasn't getting for the land in Normandy, and of course to help pay for the last war and the next war as well to try and get that land back. So he had military failures, he was charging extra taxes. So basically it boils down to this: the barons are losing money and they risked losing more money, meaning taxes could go up, and what if they lose the next war as well? Then taxes are going to go up again. And they had angry people in their own lands. You don't know what they're going to do. They might rebel against the local lords, the local barons. So the barons are actually worried about their own money. They're worried about their own power. And of course, they're worried about losing their own lands as well. If they lose in a war, they're going to lose, there's a risk that you might lose territory for yourself. So this was not the barons saying, oh, this king is an absolute despot, we need freedom for all. This was the baron saying, hey, this king is not great, and we are at risk of losing because this king is not great. So if King John was only unpopular with the church, but that is all, the barons may not have minded so much. But the fact is they were having to pay all these taxes. They were at risk of losing even more money. That is what got them to stand up to King John. They were not standing up for the regular people. This must be remembered. Now then, it is actually seen as one of the most influential documents in legal history of Britain and of the world. This statement, I think, comes to say a lot. Lord Denning, a very, very distinguished British judge, called the document the greatest constitutional document of all time, the foundation of the freedom, the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot. Well, that is what rather large, grandiose description of this particular one piece of paper. So why is it given this absolute higher echelon, upper echelon of respect for a document that was revised so many times? In fact, the laws of the first Magna Carta, none of those are in place technically. It is only the laws that were put in place from the 1297 Magna Carta that are still in English law today. So why such reverence for the Magna Carta then? Well, it sort of goes like this. King John did sign the Magna Carta on this day in 1215, but it did not last long. He immediately asked the Pope to nullify the agreement, and the Pope obliged. Why would the Pope do this? The Pope's supposed to not like King John. Well, the Pope sort of came to recognize that if the king has limits on his power, then it might make it difficult for the Pope to control or have influence within that country. Because if the king is in charge of everything and the Pope is in charge of the king, then that means the Pope only needs to get the king to do what he wants in order to have influence within a country. If the king is not in charge of everything, it makes it harder for the Pope to get his messages and his ideas uh, followed by the rest of the country as well. So a threat to the king's power, the Pope at the time thought, was a threat to his own power as well. Because it does seem weird that the Pope would help out this king. So he wasn't doing it for John's sake, he was doing it for his sake. So this document was basically immediately repealed, and the war with the barons that the king was trying to avoid happens anyway. So it didn't really prevent a war, and it didn't really grant anyone freedom, and it wasn't really followed. King John, shortly after this war with the barons, died not long afterward of dysentery. And if you don't know what dysentery is, I suggest you Google it. It is one of the biggest killers of, especially of the medieval era, but it is one of the biggest killers throughout history of particularly powerful leaders. And it is a very, very unpleasant way to die. It is a disease that you do not want to get. But this is what was said when King John died. Hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John. But John was so unpopular, that the idea was that as bad as hell is, it's now worse because John was there. So you can imagine, you're in hell, you're burning for all eternity, you're being tortured, and then King John turns up and you go, oh man, this place just got worse. That is how bad King John was perceived to be. So much so that no English king has been named John since. Now, why is King John's popularity or unpopularity so important for why the Magna Carta gets the amount of respect that it does? Well, this was the idea. He was so hated. He was seen as this despot. He was seen as this tyrant that the Magna Carta was given credit for making things better in England. The Magna Carta was given credit for standing up to this tyrant, standing up to this despot. Had King John been popular, then this particular document might have just looked like unhappy barons trying to get more for themselves. But because King John is so hated, anything that limited his power was seen to be great, was seen to be awesome. So that's one thing that elevated the Magna Carta in the historic imagination, if you will. Now, I draw your attention to this. For those who are unaware or cannot detect the accent, I am indeed from Australia originally. Now, this is the official seal for the Commonwealth of Australia back when it was formed. And you can see it makes reference to the Magna Carta, 1215. When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. This was the idea of the Magna Carta. It's not necessarily what it did or didn't do, it's what people thought it did. It's what it held in people's imagination. So because King John was so unpopular, it was seen that the Magna Carta was the resistance to King John and his tyranny. So it became a hero of a document. Now, this is what's interesting. The Magna Carta, which of course means Great Charter in English, is written in Latin. However, the king and the barons spoke French. At the time of 1215, French was the official language of the court, of the ruling class, if you will, and not just in England, by the way. You would also speak French if you were speaking with the German princes. You would have spoken French in the court of Russia. It was considered to be the language of the aristocracy. If you were rich and powerful, you spoke French. So it was written in Latin, but the king and barons spoke French. Not only that, but the peasants, who couldn't read anyway, spoke English. So at the time, you've got this document written in a language that most of the people can't read and don't understand. So how did it become this amazing document that everyone revered so much? Well, 4 of its original 60-some provisions are still laws. So that's interesting that most of them are particularly irrelevant, but this is essentially the center of it all. The body of a free man is not to be arrested, imprisoned, dicised, or outlawed, exiled, or in any way ruined, nor is the king to go against him or send forcibly against him, except by judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. So what does that mean? Well, this is how it became such a myth. The idea of the Magna Carta, the legend of the Magna Carta is what made it important. The king is not allowed to simply send you to prison. That is what became the central idea of the Magna Carta. The king is not allowed to do whatever he wants. The king cannot use his power just to punish his own enemies. The king must look after his citizens. So, whether it was intended or not, the Magna Carta was very, very influential on Enlightenment thinkers and helped shape the modern, quote unquote, ideas of justice. So, what that meant was that phrase freemen, which at the time referred to people who were essentially in the upper class or in the ruling class, freemen became a more understood general term, which was anyone who is not in prison is a free man, essentially. Anyone who is not a slave is a free man, essentially. So even though in the document they were referring to only a specific few number of people, because they use that wording over time, uh, that wording applied to more and more people. And the idea was that the Magna Carta must have been written as this amazing document to give freedom to all people. That's not what was intended at the time at all. However, because people thought that's what it meant, it started to become this amazing jump forward, this leap forward in terms of the rule of law and a peaceful and just society. So the Magna Carta actually influenced the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It influenced the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the English Civil War, as we talked about on this day, 1626, the disbanding of Parliament. That ended up becoming a civil war with the king versus Parliament, whether or not the king was all powerful. The Code Napoleon, which formed the laws of many of the territories and nations that Napoleon would conquer over his time. So, of course, he based his laws on the ideas of the Magna Carta, and the modern laws that exist in those countries are based on the Code of Napoleon. So we can see that influence and how it evolves over time. The Bill of Rights in America, the US Constitution, the abolition of slavery, votes for women, and so on and so on. So the idea of no one being above the law, which seems quite obvious today, is perhaps the most important legacy of all. So that is why the Magna Carta is seen and celebrated as this amazing document, not necessarily for what it achieved at the time. So in terms of what it achieved on this day in the year 1215, that's not what made the Magna Carta so special. That's not what made the Magna Carta so influential. It's what it has achieved over the years since then, and what we've seen in terms of the expansion of human rights, and what we have seen in terms of how we organize our society. Now, I'm going to go over this last point again. The notion that no one is above the law seems quite obvious, but at the time in 1215, the idea that you could go against your king, the idea that you could go against your baron, the idea that the law that applied to you also applied to the person above you was revolutionary. No one had heard of such a thing. What do you mean that even the king has to follow the law? The law is what the king says it is, surely. No, the law is what society has agreed upon, and the law outlasts the ruler. The ruler is not above the law. That is a hugely important development in terms of civilization, and it is for that reason that the Magna Carta is celebrated today. So I hope that you have learned something, as of course you do every time you watch these videos, and I very much hope that you understand that perhaps the idea and the understanding and the public imagination, the myth, the legend of the Magna Carta is its most enduring legacy. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a fantastic day.